Daniel very well. He's been in Planet for donkey's years, since 1995 with Daniel's first. He just told me it was the first thing he ever had published in English, and it was a takedown in 1995 of Di Smith and Kim Howells, which got him into a lot of trouble, but every word true then and true still. But he's been an enthusiastic and prolific contributor to the magazine over the years. 13 features and 8 of his own books reviewed in there, including the likes of Ethnicity and Cultural Authority, Black Skin, Blue Books, African America and Wales Wales Unchained, the edited works of Raymond Williams about Wales, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. He's the co-director of the Richard Burton Centre for Study of Wales at Swansea University, Professor of English Literature, and he will introduce you to this afternoon's panellists for a discussion of Wales in the World 2022. So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Daniel Williams.
Diolch, Mike. Mae'n braf iawn bod yma. Wi o am yr ystod, wrth gwrs, mae'n wastad yn braf dod adre hefyd. So, diolch i Mike am y geiriau caredig, falle cyflwyniad gored wedi cael. Ac yn hapus iawn i fod yn Mr Sioned Williams hefyd. A diolch i Emily am y gwahoddiad i gyfrannu ffrynhawn yma. A fel wedodd Mike, o'r Planet wedi bod yn gyfnodolyn pwysig i fi. O'n i'n yn yn arddegau hwyr, fi'n credu, oedd yna gasgliad cyfan gan Bob Williams sy'n byw ar y Waun Fawr ac yn ei arfer pori yn ei gasgliad e. Mae cryn dipyn o'n ddealltwriaeth i o Gymru ac o Llen Saesneg Cymru, sef yr hyn wy'n dysgu wedi deillio o Planet mewn gwirionedd. Ac wy'n dal i ddefnyddio yr hyn rhyfynnau'r 70au yn arbennig y trafodaethau yn y cyfnod yna. Pan oedd Planet yn dallu 20 mlynedd yn ôl, neu 12 mlynedd yn ôl, fe nes i gyfweliadau gyda John a Helen sydd yma a Ned. O'n nhw ar y way am spel ac maen nhw wedi dyflannu, felly fi'n gwybod lle mae'r un am, bydd diddordeb gyda fi glywed nhw eto nawr. We don't have simultaneous translation, so the event will be primarily in English, if anyone there was starting to panic. Unfortunately, Jane Aron can't be with us. Jane was meant to chair today, but has COVID in her household, although I don't think Jane is actually suffering with it. So I'll be chairing and contributing, so I'm glad that Mike introduced me, so I don't actually have to introduce myself. But I'm joined, as you see, with 3 other speakers. Bydd Mabli yn cyflwyno ei phapur yn Gymraeg, and Mabli will be presenting in Welsh, and between us we'll give none of our speakers a sense of what she said in the ensuing discussion. I think the rest of us are presenting in English. And the plan is to listen initially to 4 papers of around 12 minutes. Emily's very precise time, and I'll try and keep everyone to that. And then open things up to discussion. So that's how things are going to work. So let me introduce today's speakers in the order they'll be speaking. Mae Mabli yn dod o Greenstown, Gaerdydd, ac wedi gweithio yn Senedd Cymru ac fel ymgyrchydd dros ddiwygio'r system lloches a hawliau pobl, lesbiaeth, hoyw, deurywiol a thraws. Hi yw cadeirydd presennol, fel fi llawer ohonoch chi'n gwybod, cadeirydd presennol Cymdeithas yr Iaith. Mabli Cyril Jones is from Greenstown, Cardiff, has worked in the Senedd and as a campaigner for reform of the asylum system and LGBT rights. She is the current chair of Cymdeithas yr Iaith and recently wrote an article for Planet's Welsh Keywords series on boneddigeiddio, gentrification. Cyfreithiwr wedyn yw Hussein Said yn gweithio ym maes hawliau dynol, Hussein ar y pen. Hussein Said is a human rights lawyer and activist. He's been involved in many different campaigns and organizations, from Extinction Rebellion to Black Lives Matter. He gave an interview with Faith Clark in Planet 2020 on Planet in 2020. I don't think Planet has got to 2020. On why Black Lives Matter in environmental activism, and is going to talk today about environmental justice. A wedyn yn ola, Cymdeithas Sigydd bydd llawer o chi yn adnabod Dan Evans, is a sociologist, the co-editor of The Welsh Way, Essays on Neoliberalism and Devolution, and his next book, A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie, will be published in 2023 with Repeater Books. He is the host of the podcast Desolation Radio and has contributed a number of features for Planet over the years on housing, football fan culture, and the independence movement, and political education in schools. So that's the order in which we will appear. And I'm meant to start things off, so shifting from chair to presenter. I'll keep an eye on my watch. Right, 12 minutes on the future of Welsh internationalism is what Emily asked me to talk about. It's a bit like that Monty Python sketch when they're asked to summarise Marcel Proust. But I'll do my best. The early planets did not have Welsh internationalist as a subtitle. It was introduced later, and the reasons are probably in some ways clear enough. One of the common kind of anti-nationalist small n anti-nationalist arguments, especially by a British left blind to its own nationalism, is that I'm not a nationalist, I'm an internationalist. So the juxtaposition of Welsh internationalism, in a way, is a juxtaposition of the particular being Wales and the universal in the shape of internationalism. It's saying I can be committed to Wales, I can see the world from a Welsh perspective, I can be Welsh and an internationalist. Being Welsh or advocating a Welsh position is not narrow-minded or bigoted. And of course, Planet has consistently looked at the world from a Welsh perspective. Something that, in some ways, is harder to do in English than in Welsh, in that, in Gymraeg, the language difference creates a frame. And in some ways, this is still a truth. If we compare Newyddion with Wales Today in the evening, you can still see the tensions being played out there. So the advocacy of a Welsh internationalism in English coming out of Aberystwyth was very important at that time, and still is, I'd argue. So I think it's worth just emphasising that. Although the question I'm going to ask is actually, is internationalism such a good thing? That is, we kind of assume it is, and in the subtitle of Planet, I think, we're supposed to think, oh great, internationalism. But what kind of internationalism are we talking about? The internationalism of the far right, connecting Johnson and Farage with Bolsonaro, Orban, Le Pen and Trump. That's one form of internationalism, right? The internationalism of NATO, taking full advantage of the war in Ukraine, for which it's partly responsible, to solidify its position and to legitimize its expansion. Is it that kind of internationalism? The internationalism of the European Union, viewed somewhat differently perhaps from, say, Berlin on the one hand or Athens on the other. We're probably all too familiar in Aberystwyth with a kind of internationalism that assumes that a dominant culture's values, language and worldview should be the basis for human civilization. That is, the expansion of a particular culture into the domain of the international. So one form of a sort of domineering kind of internationalism, I guess. It's the internationalism of empire, if you like, paraded largely without question on the BBC, claiming that the world is in mourning at the death of the Queen during this past week. Is there then any form of internationalism that we could agree on, a kind of middle ground? In popular culture, I suppose John Lennon's Imagine is an influential model of a trans or post-national kind of solidarity. It was sung during COVID, doesn't it? It does the rounds every now and then. He's asking us to imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. I did half think of singing it, but I decided not to. Now this is less actually the imposition of one worldview on everyone, the imperial model. I mean, it's not that. This is a kind of universalism as subtraction, right? That is, the world as one is constructed by taking out everything that might divide us. No countries, nothing to kill for, no religion. Now, the roots of this view, I think, are Christian, drawing on various passages from Paul's letters, such as the following famous passage from the letter to the Galatians. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. There is neither, or there is neither. In Paul's letters, Christ marks the moment where the gospel breaks out of the confines of the Old Testament's chosen people. It breaks out from the specificity of the Hebrews to embrace the whole of humanity. And this Christian universalism has been the basis for a lot of progressive campaigns throughout history. The campaign to end the slave trade, for instance, "Aren't I a man and a brother?" appeals to that universalist rhetoric. The civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, more recently, another notable example of the same kind of idea. More recently, the French communist philosopher Alain Badiou has argued that the foundations of future revolution actually are bound up in this form of Christian universalism. There's been a return to that, a return to St. Paul, actually, by Badiou, Zizek, and others. Yet, as others have noted, if universalism has been a weapon in anti-racist struggle, it can also be frighteningly intolerant. If the world is to be as one, what about those communities and individuals who don't want to be part of that one? In a society based even unconsciously on Christian universalism, things can look pretty bleak for those who reject the one, who continue to follow the law of Leviticus and are circumcised, say, or who continue to speak a minority language. Paul's universalism then can be seen to have initiated forms of extreme intolerance. According to Daniel Boyarin, for example, if Paul did not exactly cause the growth of anti-Semitism, he did begin the tendency in the West to view Jews who refused to convert to Christianity as a problem. There is neither. Universalist internationalism, then, can be a problem. It's not necessarily an unmitigated good. In relation to Wales, this was the argument made recently by Simon Brooks in his book Pam Na Fi Cymru, Why Wales Never Was. For Brooks, the universalism of Christianity in the realm of the spirit and of liberalism in the realm of politics resulted in a resistance to the full embrace of a nationalist project. Internationalism, in Brooks' account, explains why Wales never managed to constitute itself as an independent nation in the late 19th century, like many other European minorities managed to do. Welsh radicals in the Victorian era took the view that the group rights of members of national and ethnic minorities defined their members in terms of an enclosed identity, and therefore that kind of notion of nationalism hindered their entry into a wider society. Informed by nonconformist Christianity, the 19th century Welsh rejected nationalism and wrapped themselves in the ideology of liberal universalism. Opposition to minority nationalism was made in the name of helping minority individuals out of their benighted peripherality, allowing them entry into the realm of the universal, into the realm of the international. And for Brooks, this was a disaster for the national project, a disaster for Wales. Yet might we not make the counter-argument that the broader international struggles embraced by the Welsh in the 19th century were not peripheral to national identity or working against it, but actually constituted it. That is, Wales was born in an internationalist crucible. Michael Hechter noted in Internal Colonialism, a book that was widely debated in Planet, that Welshness in the 19th century was manifested in the distinctiveness of the international campaigns that the Welsh supported, in contradistinction to the English in particular. Support for the Union against the slave-holding Confederacy in the American Civil War of the 1860s, support for the Bulgarians against the Turks in the 1870s, support for the Boers in the 80s and 90s. Simon Brooks argues that this repeated gesture towards wider alliances was and is the problem. Taffy, in the words of poet Alan Rees, supported every bloody cause except his bloody own. But Hector's work suggests that it was within the crucible of the internationalist, universalist struggles of the 19th century that a distinctive Welsh political sphere was forged. The language of rights, the language of justice, exploitation, political legitimacy, characteristic of universal liberalism in the Victorian era, created the context for the emergence of Welsh nationalism. Minority nationalism, read as being the child of liberal enlightenment rather than a reaction against it, emerges as a result of the application to collectivities, to communities, as well as to individuals, of the moral principle that human beings should be self-determining. The universalist, internationalist discourse of human rights is not then antithetical to minority nationalist aspirations. It creates the basis for the emergence of minority nationalism. So where does that leave us? Well, back, I guess, with that idea of Welsh internationalism, which is not a jump, as Raymond Williams described it, not a jump to this or that universality. Neither is it the turning of a blind eye to the wider international context in which we exist. The new afterword to Who Speaks for Wales, the collection of Raymond Williams' writings on Wales, engages with this tension between the particular and the universal, and brings Williams' writings into dialogue with the thought of Hannah Arendt, with whom he corresponded. Arendt witnessed at first hand the way in which the assumed existence of a human being as such broke down at the very moment, I'm quoting her, when those who professed to believe in it were for the first time confronted with people who had indeed lost all other qualities and specific relationships, except that they were still human. That is, as a German of Jewish descent, Arendt found that at the very moment when she had her German citizenship revoked, she was reduced to being a human in general, and most indeed in protection of universal human rights, which simply did not exist for her. There was nothing on which she could appeal, nor her people. The world, noted Arendt in a chilling sentence, found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. So the loss of citizenship, the loss of national citizenship, was the loss of the right to have rights. And the conclusion that she comes to is that universal human rights can only find expression within particular forms of national citizenship. There's no usable concept of human nature that can be accessed independently from particular communities, is her argument. The concept of human rights, she says, can again be meaningful only if they're redefined to mean a right to the human condition itself, which depends upon belonging to some human community. So though they get there by different routes, you'll have to read the book to find out how Raymond gets there, but both Raymond Williams and Arendt come to the conclusion that a tolerant world is one made of many communities and citizenships, and that dreams of universal global orders, the one of Lenin's Imagine, has tended to underpin totalitarian regimes. So I end not so much by asking what future for Welsh internationalism, but by reiterating that Welsh internationalism is the future. It is that promised land that Planet has consistently helped us to glimpse on the horizon, but it's some distance away yet. Diolch yn fawr. That's my 12 minutes. Felly, Mabli, nesaf.
Dyna'n digon i llawn. Prynhawn da, and diolch yn fawr for the invitation to speak today. I think Planet does such great work, and I think plays a really key role in opening up sort of deeper conversations about the Welsh language through the medium of English, which is something I think is really important and actually very underrated. Felly, pa ddyfodol i'r Gymraeg, what future for the Welsh language? Wel, bydd lot ohonoch chi'n gwybod, mae eleni yn nodi 60 mlynedd ers darlledu Tynged yr Iaith a sefydlu Cymdeithas yr Iaith yn hwyrach y flwyddyn honno. Yn 1962, roedd Saunders Lewis yn darogan y byddai'n derfyn ar y Gymraeg fel iaith fyw ar gychwyn yr 11th ganrif ar 20 oni bai gwrdd chwildro. Ydyn ni'n gwybod atebodd pobl Cymru'r her a sbardunwyd degawdau o ymgyrchu sydd wedi sicrhau dyfodol i'r Gymraeg. Y cwestiwn yw, pa fath o ddyfodol? Mae'n glir nad yw'r her wedi diflannu, a bod rhaid i ni barhau orfod gweithio yn erbyn yngeiriau Tynged yr Iaith, traddodiad politicaidd y canrifoedd a holl dueddiadau economaidd y dwthon hwn sy'n parhau i filurio yn erbyn y Gymraeg fel pob iaith leiafrifol. Well, many of you will be aware that this year marks 60 years since the broadcast of Saunders Lewis's lecture Tynged yr Iaith and the founding of Cymdeithas yr Iaith later that same year. In that lecture, Lewis predicted that there would be an end to Welsh as a living language at the beginning of the 21st century without a revolution, and he called on people to take up revolutionary methods to ensure its survival. We know that the people of Wales answered that challenge and decades of campaigning ensued, which have ensured a future for the Welsh language. The question is, what kind of future? The challenge hasn't disappeared, and I think it's clear that we still have to work against, in Lewis's words, the political tradition of the centuries and all the economic trends of our time, which continue to militate against the Welsh language as every other minority language. In Wales in 2022, the housing market is displacing people from their communities to make way for those with wealth, and the community foundations of the language are declining as a result. After decades of neoliberal policy from governments in Westminster and Cardiff, our communities are decaying and economic centralisation is intensifying, with communities overly dependent on extractive industries such as tourism or large foreign corporations. 80% of children and young people continue to be deprived of the language, due to the failure of our education system to grow and normalise Welsh medium education. And it's children from certain backgrounds and specific areas who lose out most, specifically working class communities, migrants and people of colour. We know how many adults say, I wish I spoke Welsh, but experience obstacles to access learning, such as financial obstacles or difficulties with fitting lessons in around work or caring responsibilities. And despite the official bilingualism that's boasted by our political establishment, the truth is that English is still the norm across all areas of life. It is a battle for people to be able to live their lives through the medium of Welsh. English dominates digital media, and our only Welsh medium TV channel has seen significant budget cuts and lost its independence. There are very few fully Welsh medium spaces where the language is used naturally in workplaces, businesses, or cultural activities, and there is no official attempt to support or increase those spaces. Our so-called leaders continue to perpetuate myths about the language as one that excludes and lack the confidence to embrace it as the proper language of the country and realise the right of every citizen to learn, use and enjoy it in their everyday lives. However, there are grounds for optimism. Through campaigning following the disappointment of the 2011 census, Cymdeithas yr Iaith managed to get the government to commit to the target of 1 million Welsh speakers. A target that has changed the discourse from one of attempting to halt decline to aiming towards growth instead, and setting a clear framework for demands in order to reach the goal. Among our successes, we've gained a commitment to abolish Welsh as a second language and introduce a new Welsh Medium Education Act. The government now officially supports the devolution of powers over broadcasting, and recently we've won several of our demands in terms of regulating the housing market, including the power to set a cap on the number of second homes or holiday lets in any community, regulating the holiday letting sector, and introducing a tax on tourism. And more widely, support for the language and feelings of confidence and belonging in it are higher than ever, including particularly among those who don't speak the language fluently themselves. And more people want to learn and give it to their children. Welsh is celebrated as a modern and inclusive language within contemporary culture and among young people, particularly in areas such as sport and music. Indeed, it's the establishment that's lagging behind in terms of having the political will to realise the aspirations of the people of Wales for the language. Mis diwetha, cyhoeddodd Cymdeithas yr Iaith ein manifesto ar gyfer y 10 mlynedd nesaf. Cymru Rydd, Cymru Werdd, Cymru Gymraeg, Cymdeithasiaeth i'r unfed ganrif ar 20. Yn y manifesto yna, fel dyn ni wedi gwneud ym mhob manifesto dyn ni wedi cyhoeddi bob 10 mlynedd ers ein sefydlu, dyn ni'n ceisio amlinellu ein dadansoddiad ni o'r sefyllfa'r Gymraeg a chymunedau Cymru a'n gweledigaeth ar gyfer y degawd i ddod. Bwriad y ddogfen yw gosod y Gymraeg o fewn cyd-destun ehangach a'r holl heriau dyn ni'n wynebu ar hyn o bryd, yn cynnwys wrth gwrs y mwyaf ohonynt sef yr argyfwng hinsawdd. Yn y ddogfen, dyn ni'n ailafel a chymdeithasiaeth, sef athroniaeth wleidyddol Cymdeithas yr Iaith a ddatblygwyd yn yr 80au. Mae cymdeithasiaeth yn ddadansoddiad sy'n gweld na fydd y Gymraeg yn fyw heb barhad i'r cymdeithas o bobl sy'n siarad yr iaith. A mae hyn yn golygu amddiffyn seiliau materol pob un o'n cymunedau ni, a deall bod adfer y Gymraeg ynghlwm ag adfywiad cymdeithasol, economaidd a gwleidyddol llawer ehangach. Mae'n galw am drefn economaidd a gwleidyddol sy'n cael ei wynyddu o'r bôn i'r brig yn ôl egwyddorion rhyw fath ar sosialaeth Gymreig, gyda grym yn nwylo cymunedau lleol yn hytrach na'r wladwriaeth. Mae cymdeithasiaeth felly yn gallu cael ei ystyried yn rhan o'r traddodiad sosialaidd ehangach, ond mae hefyd yn cynrychioli damcaniaeth neillio Gymreig a Chymraeg, un sy'n wahanol i'r sosialaeth Brydeinig sydd wedi cael ei arddel gan rai ym Mhrydain, sydd ddim rili yn beirniadu y wladwriaeth imperialaidd canoledig Brydeinig yn ei hanfod. A dyn ni'n gweld efo rhywbeth sy'n gyson gyda'r fath o sosialaeth mae diwylliannau a chynhedloedd bychain o gwmpas y byd wedi ei arddel. Mae cymdeithasiaeth yn gweld taw'r un grymoedd sy'n bygwth y Gymraeg a sy'n bygwth pob cymuned yn exploitio gweithwyr ac adnoddau naturiol ac yn arwain at drais a gormes o bob math. Mae pob brwydr yn erbyn y grymoedd hyn yn clwm. Ydyn ni'n gweld bod angen cyngreirio rhyngmudiadau gwahanol mwyn ei gwrthsefyll. Mae cynaliadwyedd, mae'r gair yna mor anodd i ddweud, mae cynaliadwyedd iaith, cymuned a'r ymgylchedd i gyd yn gysylltiedig. A mae'r pethau sy'n gallu taclo'r argyfwng hinsawdd hefyd yn rai sy'n gallu cryfhau ein cymunedau a'r Gymraeg. Ac yn y manifesto dyn ni'n amlinellu cynigion mwyn ceisio gwneud hynny, gan gychwyn gyda grymuso ein cymunedau ni, a hefyd mesurau yn cynnwys buddsoddi mewn prosiectau ynni cymunedol gwyrdd, gwella trafnidiaeth gyhoeddus ar draws y wlad a'i wneud am ddim i bawb, a chymryd tai gwag mewn i ddwylo cyhoeddus mwyn ei uwchraddio. Mae'n gallu bod yn hawdd digaloni o dan yr amgylchiadau presennol, ond yn bersonol ges i lawer o ysbrydoliaeth trwy weithio ar y manifesto yma ac ail ymweld ar manifestos o'r gorffennol a gweld sut maen nhw wedi bod yn sail i weledigaeth radical dros y blynyddoedd a chymaint o weithredu sydd wedi cyflawni camau enfawr ymlaen i'n achos. A mae hynny'n rhan o draddodiad ehangach o feddwl a gweithredu radical yng Nghymru a thu hwnt, rhywbeth sy'n mor ganolog i hanes planet fel cylchgrawn hefyd wrth gwrs. Mae'r hanes yna'n rhoi gobaith ac yn un dylen ni fod yn falch ohono. Nid cwestiwn o ramanteithio'r gorffennol yw hynny, ond dysgu ohono yn ei holl lwyddiannau a pheilyddau. Last month, Cymdeithas yr Iaith published our manifesto for the next 10 years. A Free Wales, a Green Wales, a Welsh-speaking Wales, Cymdeithasiaeth for the 21st century. And in that manifesto, as we have done every 10 years since our founding, we tried to outline our analysis of the current situation for the language and Wales's communities and our vision for the coming decade. The intention of the document is really to place the language within a wider context and all the challenges we face, including the biggest of those, of course, the climate crisis. And in the manifesto, we restate our vision of cymdeithasiaeth, which is the political philosophy of cymdeithas'r iaith developed in the 1980s. Cymdeithasiaeth is an analysis that sees that the language will not live without a thriving community of people who speak it. And that means strengthening the material basis of all our communities, and understanding that the revitalisation of the language has to be linked to a wider social, economic and political transformation. And it calls for an economic and political system that would be administered from bottom to top according to the principles of a Welsh socialism, with power in the hands of local communities rather than the state. So cymdeithasiaeth is therefore something that can be considered part of a wider socialist tradition, but in a different way to a lot of socialism as it's been conceived by parts of the movement in Britain. It's a distinctively Welsh and Welsh language worldview that keeps a critical view of the British state and its centralising and imperialist nature. And we see it as something that's very much in keeping with traditions from small cultures and nations across the world. And cymdeithasiaeth sees that the same forces that threaten the language are those that threaten all communities, exploit workers and natural resources, and lead to violence and oppression of all kinds. All our struggles against those forces are intertwined, and we see the need for alliances between different movements in order to succeed. The sustainability of a language, community and environment are all connected. And the things that can tackle the climate crisis are also things that can strengthen our communities and the language. And in the manifesto, we outline proposals in order to do that, including empowering communities and investing in projects such as community green energy, improving public transport and making it free for everyone all over the country, and taking housing into public hands. It can definitely be easy to lose hope in the current circumstances, but personally I drew a lot of inspiration from working on that manifesto and revisiting some of the past manifestos, which have really formed the basis of a radical vision over the decades and inspired so much action that's achieved huge steps forward for the language. And that's something that's obviously part of a wider tradition of radical thought and action in Wales and beyond, something that's also, of course, so central to the history of Planet as a magazine. And that history gives me hope, and it's one that we should be proud of. And that's not a question of romanticising our past or not taking a critical eye to our movements, but really learning from them in all their successes and shortcomings. Because we do have here in this little peripheral country an incredible tradition of civil disobedience, community action and political theory that I think that we should be incredibly proud of and build on for the future and for all our movements. I fi, wrth i ni edrych ymlaen at y dyfodol sy'n wynebu'r Gymraeg, dwi'n credu bod rhaid cofio'r wers holl bwysig hynny o'n hanes. Sef bod yr hyn sy'n digwydd i'n iaith, i'n cymunedau, i'r blaned, i gyd yn ganlyniad i benderfyniadau gwleidyddol a chydbwysedd grymoedd yn ein cymdeithas, pethau sy'n gallu cael ei newid. Does dim byd yn anochel am ein trywydd presennol a dyn ni'n gallu ei newid fel dyn ni wedi wneud o'r blaen. Pobl gyffredin yn dod at ei gilydd sydd wedi sicrhau pob cam ymlaen i'r Gymraeg hyd yn hyn, ac yn ei dwylo nhw hefyd fydd penderfynu pa fath o ddyfodol fydd iddi. Dylen ni ddim bodloni gyda dyfodol i'r Gymraeg lle dim ond lleiafrif ffodus o blant sy'n cael ei dysgu, lle mae dwyieithrwydd swyddogol yn unig a llywodraeth ein hun gyda ni o dan pa bynnag drefniant sy'n gadael ein cymunedau edwyno. Rhaid parhau ymgyrchu i sicrhau system addysg lle mae pob un plentyn o ba bynnag cefndir yn gadael yr ysgol yn siarad Cymraeg, i sicrhau deddf eiddo fydd yn cymryd y system tai a chynllunio allan o ddwylo'r farchnad rydd a'i roi o dan reolaeth ddemocrataidd ein cymunedau, ac i ddatganoli grymoedd llawn dros ddarlledu a chryfhau hawliau iaith ym mhob sector mwyn sicrhau mae'r Gymraeg yw iaith naturiol bywyd bob dydd ym mhob maes. For me, as we look forward to the future that faces the Welsh language, I think that we need to remember that crucial lesson from our history, that what happens to our language, our communities, the planet, are all the result of political decisions and the balance of forces in our society, things that can change. There's nothing inevitable about our current trajectory, and as we have done before, we can change it. Every single step forward for the Welsh language hasn't been a gift from the state, that's been something that's been achieved through ordinary people coming together. And it's them who are also going to decide what kind of future there will be for the language. We shouldn't be satisfied with a future for the language where a privileged minority of children are taught it, where there is only official bilingualism, and we have a government of our own, whether devolved or independent, that lets our communities decay. We have to continue campaigning for an education system where every single child, from whatever background, leaves school speaking Welsh, to secure a Property Act that would take the housing and planning system out of the hands of the free market and put it under the democratic control of our communities, and to devolve full powers over broadcasting and strengthen language rights in every sector to ensure that Welsh is the natural language of everyday life in all areas. Does dim rhaid derbyn dirywiad fel rhywbeth yn ochel, na gwyngo yn ein statws ymylol, na chyfyngu ein gofynion i amddiffyn yr hyn sydd gyda ni eisoes. Dyn ni ddim eisiau'r Gymraeg parhau fod yn iaith leiafrifol, dyn ni eisiau iddi fod yn iaith i bawb a phob ran o fywyd fel ran greiddiol o gymdeithas well, cymdeithas gyfiawn, Cymru Rydd, Werdd, Gymraeg. We don't have to accept decline as inevitable, nor cringe in our marginality, nor confine our vision and our demands to protecting the little that we have. We don't want Welsh to be a minority language. We want it to be a language for everyone and every part of life, as an integral part of a better society and a just society, a free, green, Welsh-speaking Wales. Felly o 1962 i 2022, mae'r her yna i ni gyd yn parhau a dim ond ni sy'n gallu ei ateb. So from 1962 to 2022, that challenge remains, and it is, as ever, up to us to answer it.
Well, Planet, of course, Planet has, of course, been a very important bridge, in fact, between the politics of Cymdeithas yr Iaith and English-speaking Wales, English-speaking world. You know, early editions had Harry Webb's translation of the first Cymdeithas yr Iaith manifesto, written by Cynog Davis, I think, as we're in Aberystwyth. And the translation of Tanged yr Iaith that he also mentioned. So yeah, that's an interesting paper for someone, Planet and Cymdeithas yr Iaith. Okay, moving on to Hussein Said. As I said, cyfreithiwr yw Hussein. Hussein is a human rights lawyer and activist, and is going to talk to us today about the future of environmental justice in Wales. Welcome.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Right, let me put this timer on. Right, I think it's easy to talk about climate change, and I can come up here and just talk about everything about, you know, what we're doing in particular in Wales. But I think, you know, it's really important to understand climate change is, of course, an international thing, and it's very hard to separate Wales from the international picture. Climate change is extremely depressing. It's very, you know, gives a lot of people a lot of anxiety, because really it does feel like there is no future when it comes to climate change. The IPCC released a report very recently, and it said very soon that even working outside, labour outside, would require technical assistance because of conditions in certain parts of the world. It spoke that if we, you know, want to actually reach the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, we need to, if we want to get to 2 Celsius increase, then we really want to increase our demands and increase our actual targets by about 4 times, and for 1.5 Celsius, 8 times. So it's not looking very good. And here in Wales, we're part of a country, the UK, sadly somewhat, that is part of a foreign policy that actually bombs numerous countries and adds to greenhouse emissions more so than about 49 to 55 countries combined. We're part of a country where Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Labour Party allow arms fairs to take part and take place in Wales. Arms fairs that benefit numerous destructive companies that only want to see death and destruction for their profits, and that help the military-industrial complex of the USA that itself contributes about 5% of global greenhouse emissions. We're part of a country where Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Labour Party allows toxic waste to be dumped just outside Cardiff Bay next to Bute Town, which is one of the most multicultural areas of Wales. We're part of a country where Wales, and again the Mark Drakeford and the Welsh Labour Party, allows, for example, the Northern Meadows, which is a part of Cardiff, to be completely destroyed for a new hospital which could have been built elsewhere. We're part of a country really that is part of a wider problem, and we're part of a country that has benefited from the destruction of numerous other countries. We're part of a country where Liz Truss is now talking about starting fracking again, and we're part of a country where parts of Wales will be underwater and flooding will increase ever more and destroy more and more people's lives here in Wales. And I think, further afield, we've seen flooding, on that note, in Pakistan and Bangladesh, destroying huge swaths of their countries, displacing millions of people and ruining lives. And we've seen really just no real response from the countries in the West that contribute the most to these crises. I'm born in Baghdad. My mum is Welsh, but my father's Iraqi, and I was born in Baghdad. And when I was growing up, to be honest, I sort of hated Wales and the UK because it was killing parts of my family in Iraq and was destroying the place I was born. And I think, we need to remember that countries around the world are being essentially screwed by what we have done in terms of being part of the wider UK. Something that I think I'll get onto later, that we need to start fighting more about to try and stop Parliament from doing certain things and pressuring our government to actually say something for once. But in Iraq, we're actually the 5th most at-risk country from climate change in the world. A lot of people don't know that, but the temperatures are rising to about 50 Celsius. Electricity is basically not working for a lot of people. There's numerous protests. The desertification of Iraq is increasing. The sandstorms are ever more present, and people are dying. There's been 3 big sandstorms this year in Iraq, and about 50 people have died, and thousands upon thousands are in hospital with lung conditions and all sorts. And that's often because of the infrastructure that has been bombed by the UK and by the US and by other forces in the West. In Basra, which was known as the Venice of the Middle East, it's now canals are run empty, and there's cholera that is prevalent in Basra because of the infrastructure that was just blown to pieces. And then you have Turkey that blocks dams from water going into Basra because of the geopolitical issues around the world. These issues they may sound quite remote, but they are of a consequence of what we do here and the fight that we need to put up to stop countries from being completely destroyed and then becoming more and more at risk from climate change. Even the wars that are caused by climate change around the world, for example, ISIS in Iraq, they took dams hostage in Mosul, and because of the droughts that are being created by the high temperatures, people are essentially it's causing civil wars, and it's causing numerous people to die. In Sudan, the water scarcity of a country, again, that we helped colonize, that led to the civil war. A lot of people think there's a lot of writing about the civil war in Sudan, and from water scarcity and other resource scarcity in Sudan partly led to the civil war that is still going on. And it's been one of the most awful situations for that country. And again, it's not a devolved issue, but we're part of a country where I'm a human rights lawyer, but I primarily work in immigration and asylum and then LGBT stuff. But the hostile environment of this government is something that is astonishingly cruel. I think that, of course, we call ourselves a nation of sanctuary here, but if we're going to be a nation of sanctuary, a true nation of sanctuary, then I don't really understand how our government can stand by when things like the Rwanda plan are going on. And yes, we've said that we won't allow it to happen here, but we need to start talking far more about what's going on with the Home Office and how really issues such as the Home Office, if we want to change them, we really have to have revolution, and we really have to do something concrete about it, because the Home Office in Cardiff and Newport, the amount of asylum seekers per ratio of the population is the highest in the UK. Numerous asylum seekers are just on the streets because of, again, often climate change. And again, people don't realise, but it's coming. Climate change is causing all these wars and all these issues around the world, and it's been a bit large part of it. In fact, I have clients come to me and say that I wanted to move because of drought, but you can't actually do anything, something I'll quickly get to later. But let's remember, and this is an important point, let's not indulge in privileged politics, let's not indulge in silly politics that we're all to blame for what I've just mentioned. We are not all to blame for what I've just mentioned. Pakistan is 1% of the global emissions, yet look what happened to them. Iraq is even less. But we're not part of the world that is creating all this damage. We never said, let's bomb Iraq. We never said, let's close our borders. We've never said any of that. So we need to remember that if we're going to actually try and stop this, we need to remember that the 70% of world emissions is caused by 100 companies. Fossil fuels is what's causing this destruction of our world. And fossil fuels that we are allowing companies such as the Arms Fair, we're allowing companies into Wales to destroy our environments, to destroy other environments around the world. And we can't sit idly by. And once we start thinking about ourselves, because I do think there's an issue, if I'm honest, with how we organise sometimes. I think we often replicate neoliberal ideas of struggle. I think, we're working in, for example, XR and other organisations. There's often just a cycle of activists that go in and out, and we work almost like we mirror a neoliberal organisation. We're very stratified, and we're very working as if we're all working in different organisations for different issues and all these different things. When actually you look at how the ruling class of the world organise, and they actually organise as one class. Even the stock market is organised as one class. I mean, there's been numerous economists that talk about how the stock market doesn't breed competitivity at all. It just breeds actually cooperation between some of the biggest companies that have the biggest indexes on the stock market. So we need to start organising as one. And as was mentioned, I was interviewed for an article in Planet, and I think it's really important about how we need to merge these campaigns and talk about, in Wales specifically, how we can actually fight climate change, organising as a cohesive unit. And I think we've managed to do that somewhat. I mean, in XR in Cardiff, when we blocked the road for one of the summer rebellions, myself and somebody I work with, Nassif Bashir, who's a Sudanese refugee and also a human rights lawyer, we spoke about the climate crisis that is being caused and what's happening with migrants, and how there's going to be potentially 1 billion climate change or climate migrants or climate refugees by 2050. And I think that that actually had the biggest turnout. So I think people are interested in what is there. Let me check the time. What is there to be said about climate change, and when it comes to actually fighting for a world that is far more safe for everyone involved. And again, climate change is we're not going to be spared. I mean, I think there's an idea that almost climate change won't affect us, or for example, that there's climate change is, or even, to be honest, when you invert that, people often say climate change is going to affect all of us the same. But I don't think that's true. I think the ruling class know quite well that climate change is coming, and whether they're going to build walls around their little cities, or whether they're going to climate apartheid us to death, I think they will. I think there's numerous people in Iraq, for example, like I mentioned, who use electricity, who have their own generators. What are we going to do when we're in Wales and the ruling class start making their own little places where they feel safe? The only way to, and I do a lot of stuff, I'll finish off here, I do a lot of stuff around like anti-police work, and I think we need to start looking at the climate crisis as we articulate things around the police, which is you cannot reform these systems. The Paris Climate Agreement was agreed all those years ago, and in each year the fossil fuel usage has actually gone up. We're never going to get to a point where, for example, with human rights law, that is ever going to cover climate change, because human rights law works on a private rights basis. So it's whether your airport next to you is making too much noise. It never works. International treaties are the only thing things that have any authority, and they have very little authority. So we're never going to work within a system and will allow us to find the solution to climate change, because quite frankly the people that benefit from this system also are benefiting from climate change, because they're benefiting from wars, they're benefiting from numerous infrastructure destroying habitats and natural habitats and green spaces. They are benefiting from this. So the one thing I would say in Wales that we should always do, and we should continue doing, is have a radical mindset, and that mindset must be and can only be revolution. It can only be taking down the corporations that are doing these things and not relying on people like Mark Drakeford, not relying on people in Westminster, and actually doing what we need to do as a people, working cohesively, not working stratified, not working as if we're mirroring the neoliberal system, working together as one class to fight against what is the most and biggest disaster that we'll ever face and has ever faced the world. And if we can do that, and it's a tall order, I think it's a huge order, but it's either that or again it's extinction. It's socialism or barbarism in the words of Rosa Luxemburg, and we must continue to fight against that. And we can't rely on anyone but ourselves. And I'll finish there, so thank you very much.
So much. Yeah, a lot of things to discuss there, and solidarities between movements and between the individual and larger collectivities. A lot of the themes that have been central to Planet, of course, and the environment has been over the years a central theme, maybe becoming mainstream or a central concern of the journal under John Barney's editorship, and that then continued by Hella and Jasmine Donaghy and Emily. But looking at the early ones, actually, it's a concern under Ned Thomas's editorship as well in the 70s. An early piece by David Iwan on what do I mean by conservation actually explores some of the interconnections that Mably was talking about, the environment and language. Okay, finally to the sociologist, Dan Evans. Dan will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure. If not, you need to become familiar with Dan. So, Dan.
Diolch, Daniel. Oh, sorry. Hear me? Yeah, okay. Testing. Okay, it's a real privilege to be here. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Emily and everyone at Planet for all your hard work. Just a fantastic space. And just to reiterate and echo what Daniel and Mably and Hussein have said about writing for Planet over the years has been an enormous privilege. One of the best experiences, well, as I say, best experiences in my life. But certainly one of the best academic, intellectual experiences you can have. So yeah, it's just a fantastic institution. It's great to see so many people here supporting it. So I'm going to talk about what future for Welsh autonomy. I've recently gone back into academia, and I've got this uncontrollable urge to use the word like wither, so like wither autonomy. Don't use that outside academia. But autonomy is a far better term, I think, than independence. It's also a lot more complicated, so I've sort of lost my mind a bit thinking about this. I've been thinking about what is autonomy, and there are so many different meanings and applications of autonomy. We're very focused on political autonomy, but obviously, this issue isn't just about autonomy within the British state. It's about autonomy within the system of global capitalism, which is mediated and administered by the British state, but now also by the Welsh, call it a statelet. And obviously beyond the political and economic, the question of autonomy has cultural and social aspects, and they're all obviously interrelated. I'm going to sort of artificially separate them now, but they're all interrelated. So when we look at it objectively, when we sort of zoom out and consider, beyond sort of the good news narrative, what has devolution really been about? And what devolution has essentially been about is Wales's economic position in the capitalist system. And within the sort of global mosaic of capitalism, where you have core countries and core regions, Wales is best described as like a lumpen region, or a dependent or semi-dependent periphery, a poor region It's a source of high-skilled, desperate, low-paid labour. That's what Wales is. And if you look at the global capitalist system, this is what you need. Capitalism needs these pools of very low-paid, desperate labour. And what devolution has mainly done is it's given Wales a competitive advantage in securing inward investment against other deprived areas, such as the northeast of England, which don't have their own assembly. So the government of Wales, the entire state apparatus, is geared towards securing inward investment. And what it's essentially done is it's helped lock Wales into this dependent, desperate role rather than change it. So to take tangible examples, we're disproportionately tied to certain huge corporations for our employment. And it's not just obviously the immediate employment that these corporations provide, it's the more local economy of scale that sort of flows out of it. So we've got Amazon, Airbus, Tata Steel, Bridgend, where I'm from, is formerly entirely dependent upon Ford. And we're also dependent on the British public sector. The DVLA, the Royal Mint, all that stuff was moved out to Wales to stop the Welsh economy from collapsing. So there's no autonomy there, because we have always been and we remain dependent. We're a dependent economy. And this has all got social implications. So I've just written a book about class, so forgive me for going on about class, but because capitalism is international, corporations span the globe, so we've got a global transnational capitalist class. So it doesn't mean we're talking about like the Illuminati. It just means that each country has a national ruling class which interacts with this global system of capitalism. And regardless of the weakness of the Welsh economy and its dependence on global capital and the British state, devolution has nonetheless spawned a new ruling class. And it's very important to recognise this, because the ruling class is no longer just the owners of capital, it's no longer just the bourgeoisie who used to own like the mines or the iron foundries or the aristocracy. It's also those who administer capital and on behalf of the bourgeoisie, those people who run the state. Now there's some debate about what to call this class. I prefer the term the professional managerial class. But the point is in Wales that this class has been created by devolution. We've created for the first time a national ruling class. And this ruling class is bilingual, it crosses party divides. It's a class of professionals who work in the Welsh Government, in the third sector, in the media, in the state, who administer capitalism and who uphold the status quo. So while these people are cosmetically more progressive than our ruling class in London, they've really got exactly the same interest in shoring up the status quo, and they work hand in glove with the British state and with international capital when it comes to the things that matter, ensuring Wales remains a training ground for the British military, ensuring the monarchy reigns over us, ensuring that the Welsh working class are denied a voice in politics, ensuring that Wales gets foreign direct investment, making sure we have a docile workforce that won't go on strike so we can have more investment, and so the ruling class can get more political capital out of it. So it's necessary to understand the role of this ruling class and their interest so we can understand how they act politically. And of course this class is now shaping Wales, it's shaping Welsh culture. So this is obviously very one rough, possibly orthodox interpretation of what's going on. But we have to ask these questions that, I'd say Marxists like Poulantzas and Althusser would ask. So is the Welsh Government autonomous of this class? Or is it a distillation of this class, as Ralph Miliband would argue? Or is Welsh politics autonomous? Can it act independently of the capitalist imperative? Or is this class autonomous? Or is it merely part of a global capitalist class? These are all the questions that we have to ask ourselves when we think about what autonomy is. So to go back into politics narrowly defined, I think it's really important to understand what devolution actually was, because you've applied Cymru and other nationalists, it's often seen as a big nation building process, a big radical step, a gradual a process of detachment from the British state, whereas for Labour it was always very narrowly about destroying nationalism and entrenching Labour's hegemony in Wales. They were very open about it. That's what it was. That was the funny thing. They didn't disguise what devolution was about, but everyone else sort of projected what they wanted it to be. And when we look at what's happened politically over the last 20 years, Labour have done exactly what they said they're going to do. They've neutralised Plaid Cymru as a political force. And when we look at the objective reality of the last 20 years, we've had, from one sort of a hopeful perspective, is 20 years of nothingness really. Milquetoast, lukewarm liberalism, zero attempt to transform Wales to make it a better place to live for working people. But of course it was never intended to make Wales a better place. It was only ever about shoring up Labour's control of Wales. And if we look at where we are now, 20 years after devolution, no separate legal system, no independent economic policy. The Welsh Government is continually overruled by the British Government, but again, the Welsh Government is very willing. It's a subordinate partner to the British state, but it's very happy in that role. It promotes cross-border agglomeration, it promotes nuclear power, which would see Wales tied to foreign capital for our energy supply. It promotes Wales as a training ground for the British Army. It promotes and it sells Wales to the world as a low-wage economy. It's got a very clearly defined role in all this. One of the most corrosive things that sort of happened since devolution, there's been no attempt to deepen Welsh democracy. The Welsh Labour government have been very happy with a situation of low turnout and ignorance regarding their record in government. Indeed, when we look at education, there's been a conscious attempt to block discussions of Welsh politics in schools. I worked on the new curriculum. Well, you're going to ask me about this later, but it was quite a depressing experience. And now the latest electoral changes, they lock in an undemocratic system. So that's our two progressive radical parties lock in working class people out of politics. And far deeper than the political sphere, the society which sustained Welshness as an organic cultural identity has been destroyed. The institutions like the one we're in now, the communities which sustained Welshness as a structure of feeling outside Britishness, which sustained collectivism, which sustained the language, they've been hollowed out by Welsh government policy, by British government policy. If you go to the valleys where the institutions are shut down, the chapels are being sold off, and we can't buy them back because the Welsh government refused to pass the Localism Act because they wanted property developers to be able to get best value for the sort of institutions. That was the tension. It gave into capital, the imperatives of capital. Welsh-speaking communities that sustained this organic, pacifist Welsh language culture are husks. And interestingly now, we've also got a political culture which has been totally moulded and changed beyond all recognition in a very short period of time by the norms of American liberalism. Identity politics and the cadence that comes with it, call-out culture, moralising, scolding, the marginalisation of class. This new political culture has become hegemonic. And this shows the lack of an autonomous political culture in Wales, and how quickly Welsh politics was subsumed within this transatlantic liberalism. This is a country with a bold, noble tradition of pacifism, but within a couple of hours you have people who are ostensibly pacifist calling for NATO to intervene in Ukraine. Now I want to go a bit more tangibly. So for the last 5 years I've been working with rough sleepers in Cardiff city centre. Now there's a huge homeless population in Cardiff, it's enormous. There's over 1,500 people who are easily homeless in our capital city, crammed into hostels, addicted to opiates. And it was the Welsh Government, for example, that removed priority need for prison leavers, which has made homelessness so much worse. That's a made in Wales policy. So you have this visible, very visceral example of the failures of devolution to improve basic human needs like housing. And all the while you've got this ongoing performance of radicalism by Cardiff Council, by the Welsh Government, by Plaid Cymru, but also by liberal sections of the Welsh independence movement, all saying how brilliant Mark Drakeford is, much for a radical socialist he is, how Wales does things differently, the devolution dividend, radicalism. I've just developed this massive aversion to the term radicalism, radical, everything's radical, radical this, radical that. So devolution is something that floats above normal people. It hasn't, for the people I work with, it's had no impact on their lives. But of course, for the new managerial class in Wales, devolution has been amazing. It's provided them with very well-paid jobs in the public sector. They can buy houses in Pontcanna. They never have to see a homeless person. I've often thought this class is socially autonomous. They're isolated. They live in an autonomous bubble, removed from everyone else. What this also means, though, unfortunately, is that devolution is extremely vulnerable. If and when the Tories come for it, which they already are, what can we say? And what can we say in good faith and with honesty? For the point of view of people in my community, people I work with on a daily basis, it's achieved nothing. Poverty has increased, homelessness has increased, education's gotten worse, the turnout's gotten worse, wages have fallen, rent's got higher. On nearly every measure, things have gotten worse for working class people. I don't want to be too depressing, but I really do think we have to think about what autonomy is. So even if we got political independence, without changing Wales' position within the capitalist system, we'd just be in the same position economically. Independence could easily happen and life could just carry on as it is now. On numerous occasions, COVID, the latest political deal between Plaid and Labour with all the backslapping and fanfare that accompanied that, it's very possible to imagine what an independent Wales would realistically look like, because you can see what it would look like. It would be exactly the same as it is now. It would be the same class and the same people in charge, whether it's Plaid or Labour, giving the same handouts to footloose foreign capitalism, saying invest in Wales because you don't have to pay us much, using progressive social justice language, but not making any concrete changes to working class people. Now, a lot of people in the independence movement, they say things like, if an independent Wales isn't socialist, there's no point fighting for it. Now, I actually disagree with that. I think independence itself is it's democratic. It would revitalise democracy and it would change the political culture. But it's worth reflecting on where we are. Would it actually, would independence in itself actually change anything? I know Adam Price is a big fan of pointing to the Celtic Tiger economy of Ireland. Ireland is independent. Is it truly autonomous? You've got the Irish economy is enthralled to Google, to NATO, to US imperialism. So how do we achieve autonomy? We have to think about autonomy on different levels. I've often thought about the old saying, devolution is a process and not an event. That's the nationalist dream, is to get autonomy incrementally by using the levers that we get to prise open the door. And that's actually related to an older debate about reform or revolution and the nature of the state. It was the same debate facing the Jeremy Corbyn government. Would it have been able to get through its very moderate policies? So this is how we should think about the idea that devolution is a process, not an event. Can we get more autonomy through the Senedd and the existing state apparatuses? So would a devolved state, well, as it is now, be able to stand up to international capital in the British state? Can we do things differently within the constraints of the current system? Well, we've got it now, haven't we? We've got a progressive coalition in charge in Cardiff Bay. So why haven't they been more radical? Why haven't they done things like nationalised care? We could do that tomorrow. Policies get announced but never implemented. The Housing Act was announced, I think, 2016. It still hasn't been implemented. So, why hasn't this happened? We've created bureaucracy, a new state, and that state has a class character, and there are vested interests within that state. So the Welsh Development Agency was integrated wholesale into the Welsh Government. Carwyn Jones integrated delegates from the Confederation of British Industry, the Bosses Union. It's the highest echelons of the Welsh Government also. So you can probably see where this is going. Socialism in the UK was originally organic, but then the welfare state co-opted this and turned it into a top-down bureaucracy, which has been devastating for socialism in the UK. It's become something that's perceived as it's done to you by the state. And one of the most corrosive aspects of devolution, it's been similarly a top-down process. It's been led by a minority, and it's socialised people to this disempowering idea of top-down change. Vote for X, then they'll change it. If you think like that, you'll soon lose hope in humanity. If you put your hopes in political parties, it makes people dependent. Welshness and the political culture which created Wales was organic, it was bottom-up. Trade unions, physical institutions like this one, miners' welfare halls, unemployed workers' unions, the chapels, they were built by communities. It wasn't handed to anyone, it wasn't given to us by a political class of experts. And if we look at things like nation building, there's been no civic Welshness created by devolution, and there hasn't been any attempt to build it either. However, the nation building that has happened has been organic from the bottom up, especially to do with Welsh football. Welsh culture, despite everything, has survived, and the best of it is continually emerging in music and in sport. So it's remarkably resilient, and it shows that change can happen. It can come from below if it's led by the working class rather than being managed by a political elite. Planet shows you can build an alternative public sphere that doesn't replicate the worst aspects of the British public sphere. You can build physical institutions like this one again. It's hard, but it is possible. There was a recent Fred Francis article in Planet It says we can develop and nurture and go back to a distinct autonomous political culture, rooted in socialism and in pacifism and in comradeship, that eschews the moralising call-out culture of American liberalism that's been transplanted to Wales. Thank you very much.
Diolch, Dan. A withering critique. Yeah, and a sobering analysis. I'm chairing now as a signed-up member of the Welsh professional class, so there's plenty to think about there. Sobering accounts, which, as in the Welsh way, is challenging in all kinds of ways. There's a generational shift, in a sense, that I'm aware of as well, which has been reflected in Planet. Although Prys Morgan, the Eisteddfod, described me as a young academic, and I'm holding on to that, I'm no longer even eligible for the British Academy's mid-career grant, so I'm obviously well into the twilight. And I'm of the generation of 97. 97 was huge for my generation, a student at the time. And I think we tend to be less critical of devolution itself and the government than the new generation. In Planet, Dan himself, and we've heard Hussaina and Mabli today, Yasmin Begum, Daryl Leeworthy, there have been a number of a new generation coming through who are far more critical of the current situation in Wales and the way we govern than my generation are. I mean, maybe there's a class element to that. Of course, my generation have climbed up into that professional class, so it's in our class interest not to be as critical. I accept the thrust of Dan's analysis there. Okay, so we've managed to keep to time. So thanks to my speakers for that.